For our audience, I've always considered Jake kind of, I've always considered him kind of a friend. I've always gotten along with him incredibly well. And so yesterday on your program, I was discussing how the media will likely not cover this and definitely not cover it to the extent that they have covered all of the bad stuff. They won't talk about defensive gun uses. And so, yeah, there's the clip right there, which I ended up retweeting. And one of the things that Jake had said was, well, did you miss this story? And he showed me a story that CNN ran 5 hours after my discussion with you, and I'm glad. Look, I mean, albeit it was 5 hours after the time that I was remarking on how that story and other stories didn't exist, I'm glad that somebody mentioned it. I'm glad that MSNBC mentioned it for what, like a minute or so during their morning show, and they definitely wanted accolades for that, because normally they just like to air hours-long, weeks-long discussions of how apparently law-abiding Americans are murderers simply because they're protecting their families are different from everyone else's means. And so I disagree with Jake on that, and I definitely disagree with some of CNN's other coverage, because I don't know if Jake, I don't recall Jake mentioning it on his show yesterday. I think Anderson mentioned it towards the end. I think Wolf maybe mentioned it a bit during his 2-hour program, but it definitely, and by the way, when I searched MSNBC website, Grant, I couldn't find any mention of Stephen Williford or really any instance of defensive gun use, because it doesn't go towards the narrative. And just, you know, FYI, I'm so glad that there are some people in legacy media that are mentioning the heroic acts of this resource officer. Now they can, you know, go back to I mean, they're pretending right now that they actually approve of this method of defending lives, and they approve of the presence of someone trained and armed in this school to minimize loss of life and protect innocence against a murderer, because every other day of the week and any other time that you tune into these networks, they are featuring guests indicting anyone as murderers who actually agrees with this line of defense. So I'm glad that they're pretending to like this line of defense right now, but it's not fooling anyone. And furthermore, I'm definitely not going to use just one example of one story on CNN. And what does that make it completely okay? That does it erase the slate for CNN, who had a sharp storm of a town hall, and they exploited grief, and they allowed for weeks character assassinations of law-abiding Americans and indictments of their character, impugnations of their character as people who love guns over the lives of children, them to be called child murderers, them to be said to own Congress, all of these other accusations that they allowed to stand on their network unchallenged. So there have been weeks and weeks of this. Does this one story completely erase the slate of weeks-long, horrible, biased, and I would say reckless reporting? Because in my estimation, Grant, it doesn't. It doesn't at all. So no, media doesn't get a pass on this because they journalismed one time, because one time they decided to say the truth about, look, this is what happens when a good guy with a gun meets a bad guy with a gun. And you know what? They can continue on down this line. Why don't they all start comparing with defensive gun use with usage of criminals, prohibited possessors, illegally in possession of a firearm, illegally using said firearm? Why don't they do that comparison? And then they can see what kind of headlines they get. But that would disrupt the narrative. So no, just to recap, Grant, one story, one headline doesn't excuse a ridiculous, exploitative town hall that set me up to be publicly crucified, allowed a sheriff to stand on stage and blame me for his incompetencies and his horrible leadership, dereliction of duty, and recklessness. It doesn't excuse the fact that they allowed their network to be used as a stage to impugn the characters of millions of law-abiding Americans as murderers and people who like their guns over the lives of children. One story, one mere mention in hours of coverage doesn't change that.